was good to see you in person. Well, sort of in person. And I'm going to go dark. I'll turn my screen off and then I'll be gone.
Okay, sounds good. Well, nice to see you, James.
Yeah.
Thank you for tuning in, folks. We'll give it an additional maybe minute or two to let folks chime in. All right, looks like it's noon. I'll go ahead and start beginning in with some announcements as folks are chiming in. Greetings, everybody. My name is Anthony Humetua. I work for UNM's Division of Community Behavioral Health. Welcome to the Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. Before we get started, I have some general announcements regarding some housekeeping. If you're interested in CMEs, I've posted a sign-in sheet for you to report online. If you don't mind, go ahead and do that. I'll post that for the next 5 minutes. If you have any questions for the presenter, please submit them into the Q&A and respond to all of them. To qualify for CEs, you must attend the lecture in the last 5 minutes. We'll submit an eval link in the chat. It's your responsibility to click on it, save it, and then save your copy. If you're completing the eval by smartphone, we'll have a QR code in addition to that. For CMEs, the information should all be in the sign-in sheet. Other than that, I believe I have covered most of it, and then I will go ahead and hand the floor over to Julie. Once again, we thank you for tuning in today.
Thanks, Anthony. Welcome everyone to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. This series is hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're so glad to have you all here joining us today. My name is Julie Brovko. I'm an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. So first, I want to remind you all to join us next week. At that time, we have Dr. Andrew Benjamin and Dr. Kelly Champion, who are presenting trauma-informed custody cases. Next, as Anthony mentioned, for our talk today, please ask your questions in the Q&A anytime you feel comfortable. Just know we're not going to get to them until the end. As always, we try to get to as many of your questions as possible, but please forgive us ahead of time if we can't get to yours. For those of you who want CEUs but are on a tight schedule, you do have to stay for that full hour, but you don't have to stay longer than that. So I'll try and let you all know when that hour has passed, but just know that we'll probably be staying on for a little bit longer to address your questions. think that's it for housekeeping. So it is time for what we've all been waiting for. I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Michelle Guyton. Dr. Guyton co-owns the Northwest Forensic Institute, which has been providing evaluations and education in forensic psychology since 2008. She's a licensed psychologist and certified forensic evaluator in Oregon. She's one of 5 board certified forensic psychologists in the state and the first female to hold this status. Dr. Guyton was a tenured associate professor and director of the forensic track at the School of Graduate Psychology at Pacific University in Hillsboro, Oregon. She's provided treatment and assessment services to male and female inmates with serious mental illness at the Oregon Department of Corrections. She is the director of the Oregon Forensic Evaluator Training Program, which is this state contracted program that provides initial and recertification trainings for evaluators conducting competency and criminal responsibility evaluations. Dr. Guyton provides consultation and trainings to forensic mental health professionals, lawyers, judges, and other justice-related agencies. In the criminal forensic domain, she conducts evaluations that focus on fitness to proceed, criminal responsibility, sentencing, and other competency issues, violence and psychosexual risk assessments as well. She also conducts evaluations in the civil domain, including IMEs, personal injury, testamentary capacity, and fitness for duty evaluations. She's published in the area of violence risk assessment, inmates adjustment to prison, and forensic assessment instruments. Dr. Guyton, we're so grateful to have you here today and for your time and expertise. On behalf of the University of New Mexico, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for presenting today. I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Julie, James, Anthony. Thank you to the University of New Mexico for inviting me to participate in this webinar series. I have been an active fan of the series and tuning in. So it's a great honor to be asked to be among the colleagues who have presented here and whom I've learned from over the past year. And thank you to all of you guys for tuning in to talk, listen in on this conversation and talk a little bit about certification of forensic mental health evaluators. Just a couple of notes about the scope of this presentation. One, we have an hour, so it's pretty time limited. So there's a lot more that could be said about this. I'm going to review some of the literature of what we know around these issues and talk about why people might want to move towards certification, or why people or states have moved towards certification. But I'm also going to keep it in the criminal context, right? So there are places that have moved or are moving. I'm aware that in New York, there's a move towards certifying child custody evaluators. And that's a little bit outside of the domain. It's related, but there are different pressures and things that go into those decisions versus in a criminal context. So I'm going to pretty much stay focused on the criminal context today. You've just learned about me, so you don't need to read that. I do not have any financial relationship to this program. As Julie's noted, I am the director of the Oregon Forensic Evaluator Training Program, which is a contracted program through the Oregon Health Authority to our group, Northwest Forensic Institute, that provides that training. And so I've got that, but it's not related to the UNM program whatsoever. And obviously these are my views and nobody else's. Okay, so what we're going to do is talk about some of the ethical principles and other rationales for moving towards certification, identifying some benefits and limitations, and talk about some of the procedural differences. We're not going to talk about specific states. I had hoped that we could do that. There's just not sufficient time. But I know that some of the folks that are involved in those certification and training programs in other states are here today. I'm scrolling through some of the names. I know Angela Torres from Virginia is here. Dennis Savani has been involved in that program in Georgia, and probably other states are represented as well. So they can probably speak to you better about their experiences than I can. So when we first approach this idea of certification, we want to think about what is it? What are we talking about, right? And certification is usually a step lower than licensure. Most of these certification programs require that people are licensed in their specific discipline. And then certification is an attestation of some specific type of ability within that more general domain for which the person is licensed. And this is usually done by jurisdictions, states, or possibly counties or the federal system, and requires some kind of proof of this said ability or learning that one has done. And this can be done in a number of different ways. And we'll see this in some of the states a little bit later. So let's talk about some of the reasons for certification. And I think it's important to sort of get into that and really think about, and again, from the criminal forensic context, some of the things that are related to the work that forensic evaluators touch upon and sort of the many spider webs that sort of come out from an evaluation that is done in the criminal context. You know, and from an ethical perspective, I think that's a great place to start, is that and I'm a psychologist, I'm going to speak to you as a psychologist, but this applies equally for psychiatrists who are often doing these same kinds of evaluations. Is that at first we want to come from a place of not harming individuals. And that's a basic ethical tenet that runs through all of the work that we do. And if we are practicing in a way that is unaware of the laws or the procedures or the things that need to be done to do a good job, then we may, by virtue of kind of that second piece of competency, we may, by virtue of lack of competence, end up harming individuals. And that could be the examinee that we have evaluated, but it could also be systems, it can be victims, it can be other people who are hospitalized with a person who maybe is inappropriately placed. So even though that's not our direct ideal when we're doing an evaluation, we have to make sure that we are aware of the layers, the multiple layers that are involved in terms of how our evaluation impacts other people and systems. Secondly, competency is one of the main drivers, and that really is sort of a main driver for completing, for certifying evaluators to do forensic mental health evaluations. We want to make sure that people are know what they're doing, that they have, you know, a basic understanding of the laws, that they have a basic understanding of procedures. And many of you might be sort of nodding along with me because you do this work. You may have been well trained in this work. You know, we run a postdoctoral fellowship program. Our postdoctoral fellows come to us very knowledgeable about competency as a legal construct and how it interfaces with psychology, and the real strong need to know the laws of your particular jurisdiction in order to do these effectively. So it is important that we are competent to do that, right? I'm competent to do a number of things. I'm also highly incompetent to do other things. If I suddenly decided I was going to be counseling couples, you know, that would be bad. They would divorce because I don't know what I'm doing. And so it's important in forensic psychology, where you can have a lot of what I like to call accidental forensic psychologists, clinicians who get pulled into forensic roles who may not have the baseline level of training and understanding of the forensic stance, much less a competency evaluation, to be able to do these things effectively and competently so that the best decisions can be made by you know, courts, triers of fact, etc. And then, you know, third is the idea of justice and serving all people in a relatively equitable fashion. And I think that is important because we often serve the underserved with forensic mental health evaluations. Kind of getting to this next slide, many of our forensic examinees, and I think this goes across jurisdiction, nothing special to Oregon here, is that they tend to be a fairly vulnerable population in a number of ways. Many of these individuals are people with severe and persistent mental health disorders, and so may be less aware of what's happening to them, maybe less aware of what a quality forensic mental health evaluation is, right? They may have few resources in terms of financial backing, but also including lack of access to care. Many of the people that we evaluate for competency evaluations meet criteria for indigent defense services, right? So they don't have the money to choose their forensic evaluator, they don't have the money to choose their attorney, and so they are somewhat at a disadvantage, and we to make sure that everybody, regardless of who they are, their resources, their mental health status, that they should be able to access, at least baseline level competent forensic evaluations. Another reason that people might seek to certify forensic evaluators is to note that not everybody produces quality work all the time. That there are a number of studies that show that there is low inter-rater agreement for psycholegal opinions and various other things. We also know that quality is affected by the sources of data that are included in the report. So we're going to review some of that. And we also know that when you look at expert ratings of forensic report quality, those tend to be variable at best and often low. So let's get into that just a little bit. So this is an old but classic study from Utah that looked at 100 paired competency to stand trial reports. And there were 2 expert raters that looked at these. And there were 50 examinees, and each examinee was evaluated by 2 different evaluators. And what they found here was that there was relatively good agreement on mental health disorder and what symptoms were present, right? So 79% agreement between the 2 evaluators on that. And that there was an 82% agreement on competency to stand trial. Again, 82% sounds good, but you can think that there might be kind of a 50% base rate of, right, because it's a dichotomous decision. But importantly, when evaluators found people to be incompetent in this study, there was a very low agreement between evaluators on why the person was incompetent, right? So evaluator A might say the person is incompetent and give one set of reasons for that, and evaluator B might give a different set of reasons, even though they've reached perhaps the same conclusion, right? And so that gets a little bit into some concerns about the reliability of the decisions that are being made and what the basis of those decisions is. Well, Hawaii is a great place for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons that it's great from our perspective is that for a long time, they had multiple evaluators assigned to competency and insanity cases. And so in most evaluations, you had 3 different evaluators who would primarily independently conduct these evaluations for competency and sanity. So it produced a number of reports about the same individual, which is good from a research perspective. And so we're going to talk about a couple of studies from Hawaii that look at this, because that's kind of one of those natural jurisdictional places where you can get a look at, well, what do different evaluators think about the same person and at about the same time relatively, as opposed to somebody who sees somebody for a competency evaluation 3 months later. And so in this study, by Goen, Smith, Murray, and Boccaccini, they looked at 227 different defendants where there were a lot of reports produced in total and across 35 different evaluators. And they found that overall, and this is talking about 3 evaluators now, not just 2, that in 70.9% of the time, evaluators all agreed on the competency to stand trial outcome. So either opined competent or incompetent. And there was a greater agreement for competency rather than incompetency, right? So if people were going to differ, it tended to be when there was some question about competency, and maybe one evaluator or 2 thought the person was incompetent, but when there was greater agreement when there weren't really any issues related to competency. And these authors looked at a number of different reasons why there might have been some of these disagreements between evaluators, but they couldn't really identify anything. They noted, due to the limitations of their study, they didn't kind of go into depth like Scheme and Company did about the sort of picking apart the opinions of the evaluators to understand why they made those opinions, but they didn't find any specific reasons there. In a later meta-analysis by Gorner and Murray, looking at field reliability, right? So really looking at competency and sanity evaluations as they are practiced in the field, rather than studies where it's very controlled, where you might expect to get higher rates of agreement because they have structured perhaps how people are doing the evaluations or requiring them to use similar methods. And what they found is that the kappa coefficients were not great. So for competency to stand trial, it was 0.49, and sanity evaluations was a little bit lower, which is quite typical. But within that, there was great variability within the studies, and perhaps somewhat alarmingly, that the older studies showed greater agreement than the newer studies. The newer studies were more likely to show less agreement between evaluators, which is a little disheartening because you think as more and more people are coming up through the many programs, Ph.D. PsyD programs, forensic fellowships that are available, that there might be increased agreement, but that was not so in this meta-analysis. So then another reason for concerns is that there can be inconsistent sources of information that are used in the report. And obviously, if evaluator A is using one set of data for the report and evaluator B is using a different set of data, it makes some sense that they might come to different conclusions. I'm sure many of you, when you've been doing an evaluation, you get a record from somewhere, either a prior forensic mental health evaluation or notes from a treatment center or the jail medical facility. That is really very instructive, right, for your opinion. When we find that these are a couple of older studies, but you can see here that there was a lot missing in some of these reports. So in this Halgren and Collins study, they looked at community evaluators versus state hospital evaluators. And the state hospital evaluators did better, that their rates of inclusion of materials were higher. But for the community evaluators, half of them did not reference the REST report and competency and sanity reports, which is concerning. 40% didn't include a mental status, and 71% did not include a mental health history, which is also, again, somewhat concerning when you're trying to establish that the person has a qualifying mental disorder or whatever the baseline threshold is in your jurisdiction for moving on to competency and sanity opinions. Similarly here, that there was just a lot of variability about whether people talked about diagnosis and then that nexus between diagnosis and symptoms and the psycholegal impairments. And one of the sanity studies from Hawaii by Fugger and colleagues, they found that for the most part, 81% of the evaluators in this study used between 2 and 4 sources of information, and almost everybody included an interview. What's perhaps somewhat concerning is that there were 16% of reports that were generated by psychiatrists that relied solely upon the interview in a competency evaluation. And we know that it's best practice to look across sources and also to verify information as it relates to competency sanity by at least referencing the arrest reports, the police reports, mental health records, etc. Going back to that competency study from Scheme and colleagues, one of the really interesting things that they did, and I love this study for this, is they really addressed this idea of nexus, this connection of the forensic or the symptoms that the person was experiencing or cognitive impairments and the specific psycholegal area that's impacted by that symptom or deficit, right? And to what extent did the evaluators in this study make that nexus connection between symptoms and the psycholegal impairment? And what they found is that a third of people didn't do that. They just didn't really reference that at all. Another third implied a relationship between them, but didn't really articulate what that was. So they might say something like, Ms. Smith had psychotic symptoms and she was not able to communicate with counsel. But we don't know how those two things go together, right? And then only 29% made sort of either kind of asserted that or kind of described it in a substantiated opinion. And these are kind of where we want our forensic evaluators to be, is really kind of helping the court understand to what extent the symptoms are impairing which psycholegal abilities, right? Because from a treatment perspective and restoration perspective, and also for future evaluations to understand what the specific issues were, and then be able to address those later in future evaluations. And then Robinson and Acklin in this study, and then they applied what they did in the study to another study that we'll talk about, but Ackland developed this tool for rating elements. He was very kind to share it with me a few years ago, but developed this tool for rating the quality of forensic mental health evaluations in Hawaii. And they looked at a number of elements that should be included, you know, like identifying information, name of charges, etc. And whether these things were found in the report. And you could get a score from like 0 to 100%, like on a test. And Robinson and Ackland kind of said, well, 80% or higher is kind of, you know, B or above is indicative of a good report. And what they found is that when they reviewed all of these competency evaluations, that really only the range of scores was between a really low F, right? 21% of required items were in a report, all the way to some, you know, some folks who had everything in the reports. And, you know, we all want to think that we're that 100% or like, you know, 95 to 100, but there have to be people kind of below that, right? And so the average score was only 69%, you know, not great. And only 25% of the competency evaluations met that quality criterion of 80% or higher. Interestingly, some other findings were that there was no difference between the quality of psychologist and psychiatrist reports. So they were roughly equal there. That full-time evaluators tended to have higher quality scores than part-time evaluators. And maybe that makes some sense because if you're doing it day in and day out, you know, maybe the learning that you have stays there. And that they had folks who had attended a training, and they found that attending a training improved report quality. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind for a little bit later. They applied this in an insanity study, right? So the last study looked at competency reports. This one is looking at insanity reports. And unfortunately, they found that the data was worse within the insanity reports. Only 5 cases, or 3.3%, reached that acceptable quality criterion. And the median score was a 61%. So like a lot of stuff missing from these reports are not done well. Interestingly, there were a few significant differences this time. Community-based psychologists had significantly higher quality scores than community-based psychiatrists, but that did not pan out for the Department of Health. So that DOH stands for Department of Health. So between Department of Health, psychiatrists and psychologists, there was no difference, but there was a difference for community-based folks. And that for psychologists, DOH psychologists did not differ from community-based psychologists in their overall report quality, except that the Department of Health, except in like that's overall, but in 2 sort of specific domains within the psycholegal rationale. So giving quality NGRI findings and giving quality opinions on dangerousness, the Department of Health psychologists were rated as being higher quality than the community psychologists in that domain. And then third, usually not our concern, but certainly a concern for the systems within which we work, is the cost. So as you have probably been experiencing in your state, as in pretty much all states, there's an increasing demand for competency to stand trial evaluations, right? So the number of referrals are increasing. And if we assume a base rate of incompetency anywhere from 25 to sometimes 50%, depending on jurisdiction, that means a subsequent increase in the number of incompetent defendants that must be restored, either in a hospital-based setting or a lower level of care setting, but all of that is associated with significant costs, right? And if you may find this in your state, it's certainly something that's happening in Oregon, is that the more forensic patients that are in a hospital setting, the less room they have for civil patients, right? Because there's sort of this constitutional requirement, and forensic patients can't be sort of shipped out to your local hospital psych ward, often due to security issues. And so in some ways, there's a concern about revolving door, right? If people aren't able to access the care that they need because there's no place to put them, right, then they are at risk for adverse outcomes by, you know, not getting treated for their mental health, and then being at risk for committing crimes, and then entering as a forensic patient the services they could not access as a civil patient. And for anybody who doesn't work in a hospital, hospitalization is super expensive. These data are actually more so than the way that this data is calculated This was a 2019 survey, and what they do is they look at the inpatient day cost for different kinds of hospitals. And this graph is about hospitals that are state and local government hospitals as opposed to private hospitals. But you can see that the darker the blue, the higher the cost. And, you know, not perhaps surprisingly, the West Coast is quite high in cost. And so this blue, this dark blue looks to be like an average cost of $3,200 to $4,300 a day. Now, the way that they calculate that is they also include some outpatient costs. I don't understand the formula exactly because this is a little bit higher than what we might see in some other jurisdictions. What I just wanted to say there is that our state hospital, Oregon State Hospital, currently reports a cost of about $1,400 a day for a person to be hospitalized at the Oregon State Hospital. When testifying in front of the legislature last year, our Oregon Health Authority Director, Patrick Allen, described our state hospital as, quote, the world's most expensive homeless shelter, end quote. Just noting that there were a lot of folks that were houseless with severe and persistent mental illness that could not be served at other levels within the community. And so therefore, we're in, you know, the one place that really can't say no a lot of times in terms of taking people in. So very expensive to try to provide restoration. And then one thing to think about when we think about like all of these reasons to certify is that certification is really geared towards establishing a lowest level of baseline competency. For those of us who might work in these programs, we might want people to aspire to increasingly higher levels of competency. But really certification is to say, this is the bare minimum of what you need to be doing. And so many people who are in states that are moving or have moved towards certification may feel somewhat offended by being asked to participate in this program because they are highly competent in what they're doing. But the idea of certification is to raise all boats and to make sure that the people who are having more difficulty, you know, with competency related to doing these kinds of evaluations receive the appropriate education and support they need to be able to do this in a competent and safe manner. Okay, so who certifies forensic evaluators? Well, an early study from the 90s showed that about 20% of states required certification. And most states allowed psychologists. There were a few states that did not allow psychologists to do forensic evaluations. Psychiatrists were allowed in all states. And when they required certification processes, they tended to be along the lines of a training, an examination, or prior experiences that the person could demonstrate showed some competency. And so these were the states here that at that time in 1992, I think is when they sent the survey out, were the states that endorsed having some kind of certification program for their state. And you can see what their requirements were at the time. No optional training, all mandatory, which I don't think has changed over time. More recently, Goen Smith and colleagues did a survey of states looking at who requires certification for forensic evaluators. And of the 38 states that responded, 19 required some form of certification. And these are the kinds of things that they tended to require of their examinees, or excuse me, of their evaluators. So, you know, 17 of the 19 required some form of training, review of work samples. It was less common to have to complete some sort of mentorship or supervised experience or showing previous experience. And 15 of those 19 required some sort of ongoing maintenance of certification, right? So it wasn't just enough to get certified, but that you had to kind of keep doing something to show that you were continuing to maintain your certification. Neil and his colleagues did a study of this at the exact same time that I and some of my students did a study of this. So we actually presented at APLS together on the same data that we each collected separately. And so I just wanted to show you, these were the states that we found required some kind of forensic certification. You know, 2 states required board certification. Many required some sort of state training. Some required some sort of examination. And then these were some of the kind of other things that were required for people with who were becoming certified to do forensic evaluations. I'll also say that this was done by state mental health directors. And I noted that the Oregon one said that supervision was required, which it's not. So the data may be a little bit dated or suspect over time. So I'm going to kind of turn us to talk about Oregon, because Oregon went through this process a number of years ago, and I live in Oregon and have been somewhat involved in that process. So I'm going to kind of talk to you about the process that has happened here and some of the lessons that we have learned along the way. So in 2011, House Bill 3100 was passed by our legislature, and among other things, it created a class of what are called certified forensic evaluators, which we lovingly refer to as CFEs. And it required, and this is kind of an interesting difference, is that it required courts have to, like, reports that are accepted by courts regarding competency and insanity have to be completed by evaluators who are certified, right? So it wasn't a process just to certify evaluators. It tied the courts to accept a report. It had to be by a certified forensic evaluator, or it could be challenged. There are some exigent circumstances, but the court would have to indicate why they were accepting a report from a non-certified forensic evaluator, such as someone who was, you know, an out-of-state expert who didn't otherwise practice here, or some other reason. Also importantly, was that anybody who pled to entered a plea deal to insanity, so there was a stipulation to guilty except for insanity plea, those had to be accompanied by a report, an insanity report by a certified forensic evaluator. And what was kind of happening at this time was that the state hospital and the Psychiatric Security Review Board that governs our insanity acquittees were a little concerned about the quality of the reports that were leading some people to go under board jurisdiction, right? So people who were becoming insanity acquittees. And there were, you know, probably some people who maybe didn't really have a qualifying mental disorder. Maybe it was more personality, or maybe they were malingering, or, you know, these kinds of things. And so they kind of moved towards this process for certification to say, well, if we make sure that evaluators are quality, right, and they have a baseline minimum level of competency, and importantly, that courts can't just make a deal, because some of these stipulations were often done just by the attorneys and the judge. And they're like, yeah, Miss Jones is GEI for sure. She's real crazy. So let's just do a GEI plea and dissolve of the case, when really maybe that's not what was really happening, right? So the state hospital and the Psychiatric Security Review Board really wanted there to be more oversight of who was coming under board jurisdiction as an insanity acquittee, right? And so that bill did a number of other things, but that's what's important for our process. And so this started in 2012, the program did, and it allowed for, so the statute was pretty quiet about what certification meant. It just sort of said you should create a certification process and delineate what that is by administrative rule. And so that's what the Oregon Health Authority did. And so they allowed psychologists and psychiatrists who are licensed to become certified. In 2014, social workers were approved to conduct juvenile competency evaluations, not with adults, no insanity evaluations. But interestingly, since 2014, there has not been a single social worker who has sought certification to do this. I think there's been some advocacy on the part of social workers to try to get some people to do this, but most folks say that they don't feel well trained or competent for it. So no one has done it. That's different than I think in other states where there are social workers who are involved in that process. And so this process applied to not only the forensic evaluators at our state hospital, but also community-based evaluators. And there was some funding of indigent defense became involved in this and began to only fund evaluations for evaluators who were certified, right? Because they didn't want to sort of waste their money funding an evaluation for competency or insanity if the court was going to throw it out because it wasn't going to be useful or accepted by the court. So to become a certified forensic evaluator, there's an application, there's a small fee, and you turn in 3 redacted work samples, so competency and insanity evaluations. You attend a training, and your work samples are to be reviewed by a panel of experts, and then you get recertified every 2 years. Sounds very simple, right? It remains this way. This was how it was set up in 2012, and for the most part, this is how it still works today with a couple of small changes. So this is the Oregon Forensic Evaluator Training Program. That's the part that I'm involved with. We have a training program that used to be a 2-day, but is now a 3-day training on all of these issues here. People who want to become certified to do juvenile forensic and responsibility evaluations attend a separate 4th day of training. That's optional. I was really a fan. I know that Virginia, for example, does a 5-day training. Florida does a 5-day training for their evaluators. We were kind of hoping to get to 5 days, but we finally got to 3 days after like 6 years. And even then it still feels very chock full of information, especially when, as you probably have seen if you have done these in other states, is that you have people who are coming in who have extreme experience and expertise in a particular area. Like they might be board certified, they practiced in another state for 20 years, and they're excellent and very knowledgeable, competent people. And then because our bar is set so low, you'll notice that there is no requirement for any sort of prior experience. There's no requirement that anybody has ever worked in a forensic capacity or correctional capacity before, or even has ever done assessments really before. And because that bar is pretty low, that means that the people that we have coming into this training program either are from a range of people who are extremely expert and know more than I do, I think. And then people who this is their first rodeo, this is the first time they're kind of hearing somebody talk to them about a competency evaluation. So as a trainer and a teacher, you can appreciate that that's a bit of a challenge, right? And in developing the program for folks that way. Our review panel, I think, is really one of the smarter pieces of this program. Originally, it was designed to be a 3-person panel with a psychologist, psychiatrist, and either a defense or prosecuting attorney. And they would all review the same redacted reports, meet together, and kind of produce a summary evaluation of that. And that went on for a number of years. And a lot of really great people served on those panels and reviewed all the work samples. And they had a rubric that they used, sort of a components check, similar to what Robinson and Ackland used in their study. Are these things included? And then there were some quality ratings around kind of nexus statements for competency or sanity and diagnostic opinions and things like that. The problem for us has been really getting that feedback to people. It wasn't provided for a long time to people. I'm not really sure what the reasons for that are. So people weren't necessarily getting the feedback from evaluators or from the review panel, even though the review panel had a lot of feedback to give. And then for a while, the review panel didn't work for a number of years. It's now back up and running and people are getting feedback. And so that part is positive, but I think that's a really key piece because this is really the work product, right? So you can train people all day, and whether they're able to take that information and incorporate it into their work is really a different question, and really the more important question that needs to be answered. And then people need to maintain certification, right? So every 2 years, you go through the process again in terms of turning some stuff in, go to a 1-day training that is usually focused on legal updates and topics that are relevant, that have been identified by stakeholders, usually the state hospital, the Psychiatric Security Review Board, and others, relevant others, to sort of say, these are some of the issues that we've been seeing. So we've talked about, malingering, we've talked about report writing, some of the things, and kind of gotten into them in more detail. And then really you just need to maintain your good standing, which has been fairly easy to do. There has been a complaint process that's been developed. So if attorneys, courts, other evaluators come across work product that is really not good or doesn't meet what they think is baseline quality, they can turn it in. And ideally the review panel would review that, provide that feedback to the evaluator, and maybe a plan for remediation. So how's it worked? Well, as of the most recent count, we have 117 certified forensic evaluators in the state. Of those, only 13 are psychiatrists, no social workers. So that's a lot of psychologists. There are 5 forensic ABAPs on that list, including one that was just so my earlier thing. There's actually 6 of us now in the state. And unfortunately, most of them live in the metropolitan areas of Oregon. And so if you look here, this is what's sort of referred to as the Willamette Valley. And there's probably about 4 counties or so where the vast majority of our forensic evaluators live, right? But Oregon is a pretty big state by landmass, not by population. And so many of our counties that are increasingly away from the valley don't have certified forensic evaluators listed there, right? Which is probably an issue for other states that have a more rural population or a larger landmass. So if you look at the commitments to the state hospital or commitments to the PSRB for people who have pled guilty except for insanity, that's what we call that here, it's not NGRI. And this data is from January 2010 to January 2017. And what you see is that if you look at certification kind of happening here, over time, there is a continued decrease in the number of patients that are being committed to the state hospital. There may be a number of reasons for that, and some folks believe that certification may be partially responsible for making sure that people, only sort of the people who really truly meet criteria are being committed to the state hospital for being GEI. And importantly, if this is data from the PSRB, if you look at, these are early discharges. These are people who are discharged from the PSRB for either they no longer have a qualifying mental disorder, or maybe they never did. They no longer kind of meet a dangerousness criterion. And what you see here is like, here's certification and when it started. And there were kind of a large number of people who were being booted out from the PSRB because they didn't have a qualifying mental disorder. Now, this could be because they truly didn't have, right? Like maybe they just got better and they maintained being better for a long time. But it also includes people who were said by evaluators to have a qualifying mental disorder upon admission at the time of the insanity evaluation, that were found to never have really met criteria for a mental health disorder or a qualifying mental health disorder. And so these darker green bars here show you that there's kind of been a sort of cleaning of house a little bit, and interestingly, that has really sort of dropped off in recent years, right? And so these last few years, we really have seen very few people being removed, 5 here, 3 here, and none in 2019 for not having a qualifying mental disorder. And so there's some belief that maybe certification is at least partially driving some of that because we're trying to get the right people into the state hospital and under GEI jurisdiction rather than people who really truly didn't meet criteria. So some of the strengths of the program include that, unlike some other states, Oregon's program certifies both the court-ordered evaluators who are employed by the state hospital, but it also covers private evaluators, right? That's a little bit of a novel approach compared to some other states who really focus on certifying the folks who do court-ordered work and don't have regulation over the community-based evaluators. Because of the way that the statute was written, and it said it's not about, people who work for the state hospital being certified. It was courts can only accept reports by certified forensic evaluators. That required those of us like me who are community evaluators, that we were required, if we wanted to continue to do this work, to become certified, right? And so that, I think, brings into a different level, because these evaluations might be conducted differently, sometimes at different times, sometimes with different sources of information, right? But making sure that everybody who's doing these evaluations has the same access to training and baseline level competency building. requires that the courts, so we talked about that, so that's important. And it provides baseline and maintenance training on local relevant issues, right? So you can attend a training, a national training, like these webinars, or an AAFP training, where you talk about competency and case law and things like that. But it's really important to understand the particular laws, rules, and case law of your jurisdiction, right? So every state does things a little bit differently, and has certain definitions that might mean different things across different state lines. So some of us in our office are licensed here in Oregon as well as Washington, but the statute around insanity is very different. It's sort of a more monotonous state versus an ALI state. And the case law that supports some of this is very different, right? So you have to know the laws of your jurisdiction, and having a local training with local, attorneys and judges sometimes is really going to be able to provide that specific knowledge that a person needs to practice within this jurisdiction. Some of the challenges of Oregon's program, I don't know what the whole cost is. I know that the cost for the training program, just because I'm the administrator of that program, but there are other costs associated with it, right? So states, which are generally strapped for cash anyway, would have to put some money depending on which pieces that they wanted. One of the things that we really looked at was following kind of the designated forensic professional model of Massachusetts, but that has a requirement for kind of this mentorship relationship for someone to kind of look over somebody's work product for a specified period of time. But it was felt by Oregon at the time in 2012 to be cost prohibitive. One of our challenges, I think, is that we don't have a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist who runs the program. It's always been administered by kind of a manager position within the Oregon Health Authority. Right now we have an attorney. She's an attorney who runs this program. And so she brings some specialized knowledge and skill to that. But it's never been run by a mental health person who I think could sit down with somebody and really talk to them about what's happening in their program. I think Virginia does a really great job of being able to do that, as it is kind of a piece of that is administered by Angela Torres, who can really work with evaluators and provide that feedback. I think I spoke to you earlier about the review panel hasn't always been working as efficiently. The feedback hasn't always been getting to where it needed to go. And it's moving in the right direction, but that has been kind of a challenge for us over a number of years. And then finally, kind of remediation. So there was a lot of input in developing this and sort of saying, okay, how do you get certified, right? And what does it mean to be certified? But nobody really talked about, well, what happens if somebody falls below that baseline competency level, right? So what happens when somebody's reports are being turned in as being insufficient? What do we do with that person? And so there's starting to be some work around that now. But again, here we are almost 9 years later, 10 years later, and that is just starting to happen. So I think that's an important component for future programs to look at, is making sure that they are thinking about how to provide support and remediation for folks who are falling below the specified level. And I think this is one of the lessons that we learned. If you set the bar for entrance pretty low, right? Like for us, you don't have to have any prior experience. You don't have to have attended any forensic trainings. You don't have to have worked in a forensic environment. You never have to have written a forensic report before. You can become a certified forensic evaluator with some ease. But what that means is that there should be, if you set the bar low, you're going to have to pay attention to maintenance and remediation efforts in the long run. Other states might set the bar a little higher, and they might say, we require certain types of experience, X number of hours of forensic training that you've done, or other kinds of professional experiences that speak to some minimal level of competency. And if the bar is set a little bit higher in terms of who's getting in to become a certified forensic evaluator, then you may have less concern, not zero concern, but less concern for this here. So I think there's like kind of a real balance in states who are thinking about approaching this topic need to keep that balance in mind. And I think it's important to also note that there is, as we have been experiencing the competency crisis, it's hard for evaluators to keep up, and states are going to be reluctant potentially to set the bar too high for competency because they need to have evaluators who can do the work, right? And if that bar is set too high and you've got people who could become baseline competent evaluators who are rejected, then states may be in a worse crisis by not having enough evaluators if they've got the money to fund those positions. And then another thing that we have come to really understand over time is that certification does not replace a supervised learning experience. Many of you may have been involved in such learning experiences through practicum placement, internship, postdoctoral fellowship, respecialization training, and simply going through a training and getting some written feedback about your report is not the same thing as a supervisor working with you, right? And so people who are coming in without that supervised learning experience are not going to recreate that experience by attending our training. I think our training is great, but it is no replacement for sitting down with a supervisor who can go specifically through your work, right? And so making sure people have a real understanding of what they're getting and what they, we emphasize a lot in the training about what they'll be ready to do, right, or not. Like, this does not make you a competent forensic evaluator just by attending a 3-day training. And that over time, people learn to value the experience of certification, right? So when we started certification in 2012, it was contentious, which is a nice word to use. People were upset. The rollout wasn't great, but people were upset about this and felt sort of upset about being required to do these things. But over time, people have become, you know, sort of, one, grateful for free CEs, 2, an opportunity to connect with colleagues who are doing similar kinds of work, and 3, kind of being kept updated on the things that are most relevant. So when we do have legal changes to the law, case law, these are the things that are covered in our certification and recertification trainings, so people can be kept as up to date, which I think, especially for our forensic evaluators who work in the community as solo private practitioners, they may not have regular access to colleagues like you might in a state hospital for people to be bringing that information to them. Okay, so there we go. I am all done with the presentation. The next slide has some references that you'll see when it gets sent out, but I think we can open it for questions if there are any.
Yeah, we do. We have got a number of them. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. The first question is, can you talk about some of the negative aspects of the idea of certification?
Yeah, well, and I think it kind of goes back to that slide as one, from a state perspective, there's a cost issue. And, you know, I've talked to some states who have been considering looking at certification, and the cost is just prohibitive. They don't have the money to set up, you know, an office. If they don't already have an office of forensic mental health services, they don't have a manager or you know, forensic evaluator who can serve in this capacity, the training, the wrangling of everybody. I mean, that it's not, you know, a one-person job. There's a lot that sort of goes into these programs. So that's an issue. And I think there can also be some false assumption that I have become certified to do this, so therefore I am competent, right? But certification does not equal competency. We hope it does, but people can pass our test and you know, become certified, but not necessarily have the clinical and forensic skills to be able to do the work. And I think helping people understand that, both evaluators and as well as helping lawyers and courts understand that, can be somewhat of a challenge.
Next individual wants to know who's responsible for reimbursing these evaluations?
So a number of evaluations are done through the state hospital. And so those are, I think counties pay some sort of fee to the state hospital for court-ordered evaluations. And then there are a number of people who are funded by indigent defense services to do these evaluations. And there's probably some very small percentage of people who can privately pay their attorney to pay their evaluator, but I believe those are sort of very few and far between.
Are 117 certified forensic evaluators enough for Oregon? This individual is interested in maybe an optimal ratio of evaluators to the general population.
Yeah, I think that is a really excellent question, and I have absolutely no idea what the answer is. You know, and for us, because these are people, you know, the majority of these folks that are certified forensic evaluators don't work for the state hospital. A good chunk of them do, but the majority are private evaluators. And what we don't know, because we haven't really asked the question yet, is to what extent are these certified forensic evaluators regularly doing competency and insanity evaluations, right? So for me, all I do is forensic evaluation, but even within that, some of what I do is not competency and sanity evaluations, right? And so some of the people on the list I know kind of just dabble a little bit more in forensic work. Maybe they don't do as many competency evaluations as somebody else, or somebody who works at the state hospital who does them, you know, every day. I think that's a really interesting question, and I would love to kind of look at it statewide and see, you know, compared to the population, what is the requisite number? And I think what we're finding is that there is an increasing need for competency evaluations. The state hospital has an increasing, like every year, it's more and more and more requests for competency restoration evaluations. And so, you know, whatever that number is, I don't know that it's static, and it may be growing as these referral questions grow in frequency.
Thank you. The next question is, if Oregon does not require experience for certification, what type of work products are evaluators submitting?
Good question. So if you don't have work product to submit, what will happen is the person can then become provisionally, I can't remember if it's provisional or temporary certification. So if they attend the training, they pass the test, they submit their application and fee, they will be allowed to do some lower level, not the major felony kinds of cases, as a sort of provisional certification. And then they can submit those evaluations to the Oregon Health Authority for review. And so you don't have to have them coming in. Somebody could like bring them from another state if they have that. But if somebody is just getting started, they can produce those under kind of a quasi certification status in order to be able to generate them for the review panel.
Thank you. For those of you that are on right now, I want to let you know it is 1 o'clock, so the talk is officially over. We are going to stay on a little bit longer and address some more questions, but if you need to get going and you have time constraints, now is the time. Okay, so the next question is, it seems like part of the reason for poor quality reports is the low reimbursement rate for evaluations through the counties, at least from this individual's experience. So how does one balance the tension between the ethical need for a thorough evaluation and the practical concerns of cost effectiveness?
It's one of those questions that makes me grateful I'm not some sort of state administrator who has to set reimbursement rates. You know, and I agree that I think that that's an influence. And so if people are paid a pittance to do that work, that they may be less invested in taking all the time that they might be needed, or, you know, if they get paid like a certain fee for, you know, a competency evaluation, regardless of how lengthy it is, or kind of the severity or the number of charges or the complexity of the case, I can understand that that might be hard for people to balance, you know, their needs and, you know, making sure you're getting paid at least minimum wage for the number of hours you're putting into a report. So, you know, I don't know. I think people need to, as an evaluator, which is the only way I can sort of speak to it, is to determine, if you're willing to sort of do that work, and you're willing to work for that fee, then making sure that you're following ethical guidelines and doing things. I think there's ways to streamline things in terms of how you do your interviews and how you write your reports. But there are going to be cases where you're going to, potentially not make the money that you otherwise would, because it's just going to take you more time. And if you're not okay with that, and you don't have an ability to sort of advocate through, your psych association or working with other evaluators to kind of request this and to sort of show that, people, I don't know that there's a particular study that shows that if you get paid more, you do a better job. I'd like to think so, but I don't know. So, to really advocate for that in your jurisdiction, sometimes that just requires educating people. Because, when you think about it, like what we get paid is a pittance. If it's $1,400 a day at the Oregon State Hospital for 1 day of hospitalization, and on average, people spend 2 to 3 months there, right? Like, and if you have better quality evaluators who maybe cut down on the number of people who go to the state hospital, like, you don't have to be a mathematician to understand that balance works out pretty well, pretty quickly, right? And investing resources smartly through community-based restoration services and paying your evaluators a decent fee. Sometimes people just need to be educated about that.
Can you speak a little bit to the intersection of state certification and ABPP certification? Do you think the field is leaning towards one way or another?
Well, I hold both, so I have some value in both. And I would say to you that those are different ideas. I think certification through ABPP is a very high bar. So there's no kind of rolling into ABPP certification with no prior experience like you could do in Oregon. You have to be well established. You have to have the experience to show in terms of training, supervised experience, work history, or sort of, the waiver through the early entrance postdoctoral program waiver. So, and, that's a very rigorous process, and it really looks at what you know. So I would say that is reserved for people who may be somewhat neurotic and have a need to jump through flaming hoops to prove their worth. I'm including myself in that, and really can show a very high level of knowledge and expertise in a particular area. But I think if we ever required, but there's a lot of people who practice who are excellent forensic psychologists who don't seek board certification, right? It's expensive, it's time consuming. It may not result in you getting paid more. We don't know. And so people may not seek it because they just don't have the same desire to do that. And so if states ever were to suggest that you had to be board certified, I think they would be, there's only 6 of us of 100 and something psychologists, right? You'd be missing out on a lot of really highly qualified people who really know what they're doing, and depriving states of their workforce. And so I think they're both levels of competency. I think ABPP requires something up here, at least our state certification. Other states may have higher bars. I think Massachusetts has a higher bar than we do, but our bar is pretty low. And I think that reflects the state's financial interests as well as a desire to have a reasonable workforce.
What is the pass rate for applicants?
Oh, it's like 100%. So we give a test, and almost everybody has done extremely well on the test or has passed the test. So it is, and that was our direction when we first made the test, was to create a test that people could pass if they, it's open book, open note at the end of the training. And so I don't know at the level of OHA, because I don't work for OHA. So I don't see if they ever reject somebody for not having a relevant experience, but the relevant experience is that you're a licensed individual, right? So that's really not a hard bar to meet.
Do you have any ideas about achieving greater availability for example, in rural and underserved areas and diversity, for example, expertise with tribal nation citizens?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of pieces related to that. One, sort of to span geography differences. There are people, and this is not unique to Oregon, that you have a lot of your professional workforce is concentrated to more urban areas. I think telehealth has been something that we have experienced, obviously more so in the last year, as an opportunity for us to be able to reach people in more distant destinations, rural frontier counties, that would otherwise, it would be cost prohibitive, right? Because it's a 7-hour drive, and you know, it might be a lot harder to sort of fit that into your schedule, to make time to, you know, for a 2 to 3 day trip just for a single evaluation. And so telehealth has been certainly one of the things that is sort of allowing that. With respect to tribal nations, and even perhaps opening that up somewhat more broadly, is training and developing a workforce that has greater representation of diverse identities. Forensic psychology tends to have been very dominated by white individuals. And I know that many programs, sort of at the Ph.D. PsyD level, are doing things to recruit individuals with a greater range of identities and diversity. I know people at the internship and postdoctoral level are ABPP and AAFP are kind of working on ways to promote a more diverse workforce at that level. I think those things take a lot of time to do, but it is important that we bring those cultures and those perspectives from people's different backgrounds and heritages, that those voices and identities are represented, and can kind of speak to some of this. You know, we talk a lot about, you know, cultural expressions around mental health, and being able to recognize, you know, idioms of distress, but it goes so much more deeper than that, right? To be able to sit and connect with somebody, and for that individual to develop a sufficiently basic trust, and for you to know what you're looking for, is a lot more deeper than just kind of reading these things in the DSM. And so by bringing more diverse people into this field, I think we do a much better job at serving the people that we are providing this service to.
Do you have any outcome data, or is anything being collected right now to determine whether certification improves inter-evaluator reliability or agreement or the quality of the report?
That whoever asked that is singing to my heart right now. So we did an initial set, but we weren't allowed to publish the data. But we looked at the data of people coming in. So in 2012, like those initial evaluations, kind of pre-certification, and the quality markers were pretty low, lower than some of the published studies that were here. And so we have been asking to do that research, to kind of look at, you know, maybe those original reports, and then maybe pair those up with the same evaluators over time, and to be able to look at, like, is there improvement, right? Which could be a function of this training and this certification process, but could also be, you know, a number of other things. People could have joined groups where they're, you know, consulting with others, or they've gone through the board certification process, or they've attended a lot of workshops or things like that. So we would like to do that data. We've not been allowed to do that data or data collection yet, although we've asked. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do that. And I think sort of showcase what training in and of itself can do, and what it can't do.
Are they providing you with a reason of why you're not allowed to collect this data?
It wasn't a reason, like I don't think they wanted to provide the data. They said that they would do their own data analysis if they wanted to. And so maybe somebody within OHA would be able to do that. So for my colleagues who are watching and listening, I know who you are, I saw your names. Maybe you guys could get access to that data in a way that I couldn't as an outsider.
Next individual says this isn't really a question as much as a concern. How will courts misinterpret certification as competence or even worse, expertise? It's what this individual has found in many years of court testimony. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that very much. I was actually talking to a colleague a little while ago who told me that they're a certified forensic evaluator, and they said that one of the attorneys just kind of ripped into them anyway about their level of competency and what this attorney perceived as a lack of competency in a particular domain. And so I think it is important as an evaluator to talk about what certification means and what it doesn't mean, and to be straightforward and honest about that, I passed an open book, open note test after a 3-day test, and I got some feedback on some reports. It doesn't qualify me as an expert. In the face of people not being honest about that and forthright with the courts, I think sometimes other evaluators who are knowledgeable about that can be brought in to talk about what that means or doesn't mean. And I think people are always going to be defensive or potentially be defensive about their qualifications if they perceive that they're going to be attacked for a lack of them, right? Just like any of us might, when we go into court, sort of, perceiving how we're going to be attacked potentially by the other side. But then at the same time, making sure that we are straightforward and we have an ethical duty to be honest about what our level of experience is.
Okay. Are clinicians providing restoration services required to be certified in your state?
Nope. So we have competency-based restoration both in hospital and in the community. I'd say Oregon has one of the more robust community-based restoration programs. Certain counties are better developed at that than others, but there is no requirement of certification or baseline level competency for that.
All right, we are 15 past, so one more question.
Okay.
This individual would like to know how they can find out where their state stands with regards to establishing this particular type of program, if it doesn't have one yet.
If it doesn't have one, if like this comes through legislation, right? So this is usually a legislated process. And so I would check in if you have some sort of Office of Forensic Mental Health Services or people who kind of are in the know there, or the directors of forensic programming at your state hospital. I think I would check in with them to see if there's been talk of this kind of thing, because I think it has tended to generate from those offices, from state hospitals, from bodies that govern insanity equities. Sometimes that is the state hospital, and check in with them to see if there's been any question or movement towards this.
Well, thank you so much. This was fantastic. We really, really appreciate your time. And I can tell, we have even more questions. So everyone was really interested.
Well, thank you. Well, it was a wonderful opportunity to get to be with all of you guys and to talk about this. And if people have questions, they can always feel free to email me.
Okay, perfect. Have a great day. Everyone that's still on, we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Anthony.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Guyton. All right, Julie, I think I'm going to go ahead and can it now.